And when they hit you, they hit me. And if you can get this, this will help you. Because you got moments in your life where you go, where was God when that little girl was being raped? Where was God when that teenager died? Where was God when that old saint of the faith got cancer and we lost her? Where was God? And in some theologies you'll go, well, God made it happen to teach us a lesson. The goodness of God need not kill people to teach lessons. Yes. Instead, here's what we might come up with. When I'm smitten, I can only turn the other cheek because He was just smitten with me. So when it was happening to that little girl, it was happening to Jesus. When it was happening to that young man, it was happening to Jesus. When it was happening to that old saint, it was happening to Jesus. Surely He has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, and we did esteem Him stricken and smitten of God and afflicted. He knows what we're going through because He's going through it with us, which is the only reason that we learn to turn the other cheek, to not resist, because we watch our Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He offers His cheek to Judas Iscariot, and Judas kisses it and calls him friend. Jesus knows what's coming because Jesus told him in the upper room, go do what you do quickly. And yet He walks right into it. And we would call Jesus naive and weak. And yet from that place He conquers the world. Because at Calvary it introduces us to a resurrection. And resurrection introduces us to a new man on the earth. What's God look like in Matthew? He turns the other cheek. He receives whatever pain you receive. He takes it into Himself so that you can know you are not alone. I've shared that with people who've had loss, lost children, lost loved ones, lost friends. They go, why'd God let this happen to me? Oh no. God let it happen to him. God let it happen to him. He was in there with them. No matter what furnace you go into, there He stands. That's why we need our lion to look like a slain lamb. Because from the place of a slain lamb comes the victory. And then we roll into Mark. Now there's a lot in each one of these Gospels that we could spend time on. We roll into Mark, and I want to give you a healing moment in the life of Jesus. Not just a healing moment, but a forgiveness moment as well. Look at Mark chapter 2, if you would, for a moment. Mark chapter 2, Jesus is in Capernaum some days, and He's been there for several days. There are people gathered together. And in verse number 3, they came to Jesus bringing a paralytic who was carried by 4 men, and they could not come near Him because of the crowd. And they uncovered the roof where He was. So when they had broken through, they let down the bed on which the paralytic was lying. When Jesus saw their faith, He said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven you." I want to point out 2 things in this story. One happens at the beginning of verse 5, when Jesus saw their faith. And I want you to notice that Jesus is looking at the men who tore the hole in the roof to lower their friend into the room. There's not a shred of evidence in Mark chapter 2 that the paralytic man even knows what's happening. It isn't the paralytic man who shows faith in Jesus. It isn't the paralytic man who Jesus confronts with healing. It's the 4 men who lower the paralytic man into the room. He says He saw their faith. And so this is a remarkable moment where God accepts the faith of someone else, accepts the faith of someone else on behalf of someone else. And He does it in the form of Jesus. And the last part is where Jesus looks at the paralytic man and said, "Son, thy sins be forgiven thee." And this is one of the more remarkable moments in the Gospels, because Jesus does something that up until this moment we have not seen to be a possibility in the Bible. How many of you realize that the Old Testament legal system provided a blood sacrifice for sin? If you sin, you killed a bullock or a goat or a lamb or a pigeon or a turtle dove. And you could kill whichever one you could afford, because grace was supposed to be commensurate with your ability. So if you didn't have much, you could offer up a pigeon. If you had a lot, you were supposed to offer up a bull. Interestingly enough, you didn't get more forgiveness if you were rich and had a bull than you did if you were poor and had a pigeon. It wasn't about the size of the offering. It was about the offering that you gave being commensurate with what you could give. By the way, when Mary brought baby Jesus into the temple with a sacrifice, she brought a pigeon and a turtle dove, which tells you that the family of Christ didn't have a lot of money. And so they ended up on the low end of that financial totem pole. You didn't receive less of God's favor or less of God's grace, but you had to pay something out of pocket. Forgiveness of sins was something that was achieved by the shedding of blood. In fact, the Old Testament said, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. And yet Jesus looks at the paralytic man and said, "Son, thy sins be forgiven thee." And I want to ask you, what gave Jesus the right to do that? The young man didn't offer up a sacrifice. The young man didn't shed blood. The young man didn't go to temple. Let me give you another one. The young man didn't confess his sins. The young man didn't say the sinner's prayer. The young man didn't ask Jesus into his heart. The young man didn't even quote Bible. There's no evidence the young man ever even said a word. In fact, there's no evidence the young man even had any faith. Who was Jesus talking? This is why I pointed this out. He saw their faith. Whose faith? The 4 boys that lowered him through the roof. He saw their faith and confronted the young man and said, "Son, thy sins be forgiven thee." You want to see God in the Gospels? Don't ever tell God who He can forgive and how He forgives them. Don't put parameters on Him. Don't put rules on Him. Don't put structures on Him. Jesus sees a guy laying on the floor and realizes that he's got sin and wants to offer forgiveness. He doesn't wait on the guy to do anything. He doesn't wait on the guy to say anything. I'm amazed at how much we believe we know who qualifies for the goodness and the forgiveness of God. And yet here's Jesus going, "Son, thy sins be forgiven thee." If you want to see what God looks like, forgive people. Yes. Forgive them before they ask. Forgive them while they wrong you. Forgive them when they don't ask. Forgive them when they don't want it. Forgive them when they don't believe in it. You want to look like Jesus? Stop waiting around to find out if people qualify for God's forgiveness or God's grace or God's love. And I'm here to tell you, Jesus is what God always looked like. Jesus is what God looks like. Jesus is what God will always look like. So God isn't waiting around for our approval on who He gets to forgive. They confronted Jesus and said, "How dare you do this?" And Jesus said, "What would be easier, for me to say you're forgiven of your sins, or son, take up your bed and walk?" He said, "But so you'll know I have power to forgive sins, I have said it to him and will now say to him, son, take up your bed and walk." And the reason Jesus says this is because if I don't have the power on earth to forgive sins, I just blaspheme God. And there's no way this kid's getting up if I blaspheme God. Because there's no way God would heal this kid if I just stood here and blasphemed by forgiving his sins. So let's see if this works. And I don't think Jesus crossed his fingers and closed his eyes and said, "Boy, I hope that Dad will do this." Because he wasn't trying to change God's mind. He was showing us God's heart. Yes.